We're going to bring you back to breaking news right now. That is the scene in front of Parliament Hill. We are now into our third week of what the Prime Minister calls an occupation by these truckers who have refused to move after lots of calls for them to go home from the Premier, from the Mayor, from the Prime Minister. Now, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is invoking the Emergencies Act to give the federal government extra powers to deal with these protesters right across the country. They were able to clear out the Ambassador Bridge, get that flowing again. Trucks are now going across, as we heard from Chris Ensing not so long ago. But still, we have the occupation here in Ottawa and still unable to clear out those protesters. So to bring us up to date on all the latest, David Cochran joins us with more. Hi, David. Thanks for jumping in here. So with this Emergencies Act, what exactly will the Prime Minister use it for?
Well, that remains to be seen, Hannah, in some ways, because we know that this is his intention. The Prime Minister informed his caucus of this decision this morning after speaking with his cabinet late on Sunday night, and he's currently right now meeting with the premiers to walk them through what his plans are. And of course, under the Act, he is required to consult with the provincial governments before doing this. Now, this will be the first time in Canadian history that the Emergencies Act has been revoked. This is a piece of legislation brought in July of 1988 to replace the War Measures Act, which has been used throughout history since it was brought in at the start of the First World War for fairly excessive violations of people's rights. You look at the internment of people during the various wars. You look at the mass arrest during the October crisis in Quebec. And the Emergencies Act has a far more limited scope of powers than that. Everything has to be reviewed by Parliament. The Charter of Rights and the Constitutions fully apply to the action, so Cabinet can't act unilaterally to violate people's rights. But what it does do is it gives the federal government a limited scope of powers to deal with five essential things, five different national types of emergencies. A national emergency, a public welfare emergency, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. My reading of the situation would suggest that a public order emergency is essentially what this would be declared, that a state of affairs constituting an emergency is at hand in Canada. And if that is what the Prime Minister does in fact do, he has 4 or 5 things under the Act that a public order emergency grants the federal government to do. For example, they can regulate or prohibit public assembly that may reasonably be expected to lead to a breach of the peace. They can also limit travel to and from within a specific area. So you look at what's there on the screen now. The siege of Ottawa, as Doug Ford calls it, this occupation of the downtown core of the national capital, 10 to 15,000 residents essentially held hostage by trucks and tents and bouncy castles on the weekend, stopping them from living their normal life. They could make this an illegal assembly under federal law and then have federal authority to enforce this. Because Hannah, you know this, the great frustration in this city is the reluctance and apparent helplessness of the Ottawa police services to deal with this. After they made the decision on that opening weekend to allow all of these heavy trucks and infrastructure to move into the downtown core of the city, they've now set up what has become a semi-permanent encampment. The Ottawa Police Service says that they are overwhelmed and don't have the capacity to deal with this. And there's been a significant amount of jurisdictional finger pointing between the municipal, provincial, and federal governments. Well, this is right on the Prime Minister's front door. That dark brown building you see there on the left of that photo, that is in the middle of the screen there, that's the Prime Minister's office, which he's unable to enter. So if the Prime Minister is going to wear this politically, this act essentially allows them to own it and control the response to what has been happening at these various protest points around the country, because this would give them the ability to designate and secure protected places, maybe the parliamentary precinct, maybe the bridges and the border crossings. They can assume control of public utilities and services, so they could essentially take control of things that are required that maybe the city runs or the province runs to respond to this. And they can direct any person or class of persons to render essential services. So we've heard tow trucks being reluctant to come in and move. Well, suddenly they can be conscripted into service under this particular act. Now, people would have to be compensated for anything they're required to do, but it allows the federal government to do this, as well as imposing fines and indictments for contravention of any order or regulation made under this section. Now, Hannah, we're in Ottawa. We focus on this, but you look at the blockade in Coutts, Alberta, which has now gone on for more than 2 weeks. Police are soft enforcing that, mailing people tickets. Jason Kenney and the Alberta government is certainly out of patience. And I think while there was a reluctance during the early days of the pandemic in the response to COVID-19, Hannah. You remember a lot of people calling for Justin Trudeau to bring in the Emergencies Act. They didn't want to go there. I suspect a far more receptive audience at the First Minister's meeting today to deal with these ongoing protests and blockades across the country.
Yeah, let me just tell you what we're hearing from sources in that meeting right now. We're hearing that the Prime Minister has made it clear that this won't be about the military. We also heard the Prime Minister say that, I'm stuck on my weeks now, but it was Friday, I believe, saying that the military is not one of the options at this point.
Yeah, right. That is what he told caucus today, and that is certainly what is happening right now in the First Minister's meeting. They're describing the act and what they're going to be going through in the conversations right now with the First Ministers. Anita Anand, the Defense Minister, who's been in Europe dealing with the Ukraine situation for a chunk of this time, has made it clear that the Canadian Armed Forces are not a police force, and that certainly isn't the intention. Now, whether the military is brought in to do other things, say once the people are cleared out to help move some of the trucks that are left behind, because obviously the Canadian Armed Forces has large, heavy equipment that can move tanks. If you can move a tank, you can probably move a big rig. I mean, that's potentially down the road, but there is very little appetite at the federal level to use the Canadian Armed Forces against Canadian citizens in a law enforcement capacity. And I think the Prime Minister has made that clear publicly. They're not categorically ruling it out because you just don't know where this situation could go. I mean, who thought the capital city would be occupied for 18 or 19 days in the downtown core? But yes, what they're talking about now is essentially taking control of the situation through the Emergencies Act and coming up with a centralized, coordinated response because, the Windsor Bridge even, that got dealt with pretty quickly because the economic stakes of that, $300 to $500 million of goods a day going across there, depending on which numbers you look at. That was a protest on a municipal road off the bridge. So it was a federal border crossing that was impacted, but it was on a municipal, provincial area of jurisdiction. So where these protests are happening at these intersections of jurisdiction has created a real mess, especially here in Ottawa. You even look at Coots, Hannah, that's a provincial highway, but the RCMP is the police force there because they're contracted to do provincial policing. And, this is Canadian federalism. The phrase, the problems with it and challenges with it playing out in real time. So I suspect, Hannah, also we will have to hear from the Prime Minister today.
Yeah.
If he's going to do this, he's going to need to speak to the country and explain why, whether that's in Parliament or whether that's in a news conference. I do not know. I don't even know for sure if it's going to happen, but it's an easy assumption that after an emergency cabinet meeting during the Super Bowl, an early morning caucus meeting on a Monday, and now a surprise First Minister's meeting, that the Prime Minister will certainly have to speak to Canadians after speaking to the country's leadership at some point.
And I think there will be a clear message once again to those people who are occupying the downtown, who are in Coots, from the Prime Minister to go home.